Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
And welcome, everyone. I am Doug, and I am glad to be here with my compadre. Hello, Cody.
How are you?
I'm doing great. It's that time of year, man. Can you believe it?
I am excited. I like this time of year.
Yeah, I do too. This whole holiday thing, starting with Thanksgiving, it's just a really cool time of year. Lots of family and lots of good food, and just really relaxing. Kids, grandkids, especially all the excitement of little ones around this time of year. It's always fun to watch them. Our family pretty much got out of the gift-giving thing some years back because there are so many people here in Atlanta where we are, so many adults. That's like, hey, we're just not, even with the 4 kids, it's like, nah, we'll do grandkids under the Christmas tree, but there's so many now. You end up just getting something to get it. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. I'm sure all of our listeners have received gifts that they did not want.
Well, the worst one of all, I think we can all agree, is the fruitcake. The fruitcake.
Actually, one time, I remember one Christmas gift. One Christmas, I thought I was getting, and I think if I recall correctly, I thought I'd asked for like a PlayStation 2.
Yeah.
All I remember is not getting the gift that I had asked for, which I believe was a PlayStation. But the one gift I did get was a Bible with my name like inscribed on it. And I remember, I don't know of a worse gift at Christmas than to buy someone a Bible.
Exactly. Buying your wife a vacuum cleaner, maybe. But other than that, no, it's a great time of year, and it's just funny how people everywhere seem to be in better moods this time of year. Maybe it's because everyone knows they're going to be off work more. But great time of year. So everyone is here listening to this now on the 19th of December. Christmas is this next week. And Cody, you and I are going to take a little bit of a break here over Christmas and New Year's holiday to refresh ourselves before we do a reboot on our salvation series.
Absolutely. Yeah. We I have parties to attend to.
Yes.
And got to bring in the new year.
Absolutely.
2019.
Yeah. Wow.
Times are a-changing.
They are changing. So what we've decided is after today, we will be back the middle of January, which puts us right at January the 16th. We generally try to get these out on a Wednesday, and I think we're pretty good about that. And so the next time we'll be posting another podcast will be January the 19th. We will continue this salvation series because we're getting some really great feedback, a lot of emails, which we, again, really appreciate all of the thoughts, ideas that so many of you bring to the party. Thank you for that. And so many people who have shared common experiences or have and are having these very same conversations with your relatives, your family members, because generally the bigger the family, the more diversity you'll have in religious beliefs or non-beliefs. And this thing of salvation, Cody, I mean, look, I don't know how you could find a subject any more geared toward the centrality of what the narrative is all about, and especially what the religion of Christianity has been all about than this subject of salvation.
Yeah, and we have spent a few episodes now talking about our own experiences and then kind of walking through the history throughout the narrative of what actually is salvation. What I'd like to do today, Doug, is I have a few questions for you. So you're in the hot seat today.
I'm ready.
And I want to talk about maybe 3 large questions, which open up maybe to a couple more, but we'll see how time permits. What is salvation now? Are people still saved today? And are you saved? And when were you saved?
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
So essentially what I want to go for is, well, what is salvation now? We've kind of traced it through the narrative, but what does it look like for us in 2018? Are people still saved? And so these are the questions that I have. We can start wherever you want. It might be a good place just to ask you, even before we get into what is salvation now, which might answer itself. But would you say, are you saved? Even in light of how you how would you even define that? And then would you say that you are saved? And then obviously we've been talking about this. If you answer yes to that, well, why?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because this is what everyone's writing to us about. These are the discussions that go on that have been all over the board for the last 2,000 years. What has caused so much confusion about the subject of salvation is the interpretation by the blue meme in the time of Jesus, after Jesus and the apostles left the scene. The blue memes of that worldview began to interpret salvation or obtaining God identity, pleasing to God, etc. They just basically turned it into the same type of paradigm as the paradigm of Moses, which preceded them, which was a paradigm of what have you done in order to ensure and make sure that you are saved. You know, you've already brought up a couple of times your particular experience. You heard messages which were interpretations of the biblical narrative that were causing you to fear that perhaps you had not done enough, or you had not done something correctly. You had not received it, accepted, confessed something about this salvation that ensured that you, in fact, had it. And therefore, you went through these experiences, these being saved experiences on multiple occasions. So we're coming from an opposite direction. What we're saying first and foremost about the narrative is that this idea of salvation, this idea of being at a place in your life where you're at a place of peace, not of fear, that you do not have anxiety and worry, that you're at a place where you can really sleep good at night, that place is something that is assured in the narrative. No question about it in the narrative. And the reason there aren't any questions about it is because it's taken out of our hands. Salvation is not something that I am the source of or have anything to do with, nor do I have anything to do with my identity. My identity, we've talked about that, Cody, for months, and the fact that identity of the human being is God identity, that every human is created by God. God's the source of the image in which we're created. God is the source of the breath that's breathed into us. God is also the source of salvation. So when I think about, are you saved? When were you saved? All that kind of thing. We were talking one day, and I was telling you about being asked, are you saved, or when were you saved, at one of the conferences? And I said, yeah, I was saved about 2,000 years ago. And the reason why is because it was not something that I personally did. Salvation is something about which I became aware. I didn't birth myself. I didn't put the image of God in me, and I didn't put the breath of God in me. Those are all things that I became aware of that God as source had done. So when I think about salvation, are you saved? Are people still being saved again? I go back to our quadrants and our integral approach to the narrative. The quadrants have told us that there is a role and function in the transformation of a person from bondage into freedom, which is the movement into salvation, and that transformation has both an individual component and a collective component. That's what we talked about, right? So from an individual basis, salvation is founded upon Jesus the individual. That is only a part of it because that doesn't address the collective. So what does the narrative have to say about the individual? The writer of Hebrews goes at great lengths to say that regarding salvation, Jesus in his work died once, one time, and for all people. So this salvation work of Jesus is completed. Nobody's waiting for Jesus to come back and be crucified anymore. Nobody's waiting for Jesus to come back and do any more ministering, any more work that he's already done. Everyone says, oh yeah, that's done. That's completed. We're not waiting for anything else. So that foundational work was done. Now that does bring us to the collective, right? And so the question is, when was the collective delivered? And that's where we got into the transformation that involves the collective in the last days period, the transformation period.
Okay. Oh man, this is insane. Sometimes I just shake my head like, what are we doing? Okay. We need to go back to, okay, you answered this question. Okay, well, I was saved, which that whole term, oh man, I just feel like I need to go back to therapy, but it's my own personal issues because that term was so abused because of what you had to do right now.
Yeah.
But you said 2,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Are you referencing what transpired on the cross specifically? Because we need to talk about that for a minute, because there is still this mindset of something magical in a sacrificial way happened on the cross, right? I mean, there are loads of atonement theories, which we don't have time to go into, but I will say this, like the dominant one that I grew up in was what they call penal substitutionary atonement theory, which sounds like a disease.
Yeah. You don't want to get those results back.
Penal substitutionary atonement.
Well, unfortunately, I think millions have it.
Oh my God, it is a disease.
Yeah. And because of televangelism, it is communicable.
Oh, good Lord. And essentially what it was is, okay, first of all, like the first followers of Jesus, like these first Christians, like in the biblical narrative, they interpreted Jesus' life and death through like the lens of a sacrificial system because that was their primary lens of understanding God, right? So you think about, this is the world in which they knew. They were at their particular stage of consciousness at that time. They operated in a world of sacrificial systems. So when you read writings, like sometimes even Paul uses different metaphors about what took place on the cross, this is why they write about that, because this is the world in which they live. Now, when you really get down to like this idea of penal substitutionary atonement, it is essentially this: God sent himself to sacrifice himself on the cross to save us from himself.
Makes perfect sense to me, Cody. I'm convicted. I mean, that right there convicted me.
And there are lots, and I mean many, a myriad of groups and religious systems that subscribe to Jesus being the ultimate sacrifice. And the problem is God didn't need a sacrificial system. It's like the people did. God didn't need some blood to be shed, right? It's like the people needed it. But where I want to get at is, when you say 2,000 years ago, what exactly do you mean? Did something transpire on that cross? Is it something that happened later? When you look at the Venn diagram, you have the cross starting this transformation process, but then you have it ending when the temple goes down.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you mean by 2,000 years ago?
Yeah. Great question, because again, we're trying to define salvation, and is it applicable today? Should we be out trying to save people today? And of course, my answer to that is no. We cannot do what God's already done.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Man, that's good God. Because I think what's happening is a lot of progressives.
Yeah.
At least, again, I know we have listeners on an international level, but
right.
Here, a lot of progressives or postmoderns have intuitively known to some degree that, converting people and trying to force them or bribe them or lure them into reciting a prayer and or acknowledging this Jesus and getting saved is something that they've already walked away from.
Yes.
But what's really interesting is though, is when you ask about salvation, lots of people still don't know what to do with it. They're like, we know that doesn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
And we know we don't interpret it that way, but we're not real sure what to do with these references when Jesus is like, I came to seek and save the lost.
Right. Well, and so going back to some of the things you were saying on atonement and the cross, there are two aspects to salvation. We'll talk about the cross first and Jesus the individual. The second component to salvation is what happened after the cross. And that was regarding the collective. And we'll talk about that secondly. But first of all, on the atonement theory and the cross and Jesus as a sacrifice, all of the sacrifices that came under the first creation, the first covenant, that first world order, were sacrifices that were external to the human. And a sacrifice was something that a human did that somehow or another was symbolizing that their sins were forgiven. Now, that's all they knew about that. So you sacrifice the bulls, the goats, you shed that blood, and for them, that was something they did in order to receive forgiveness from God. So you can see why people would have looked at Jesus in the same light that they would have looked at animal sacrifices, because that's the way they understood sacrifice. And
it was almost like a rite of passage to some degree.
Yeah.
It was the external, okay?
Yes.
If you take the quadrants
Yep.
of what was happening internally.
Yes.
And it was like their way of acknowledging, I can release my anxiety about where I stand with the divine because now I know I've done something, sacrificed this animal, and the divines are pleased. Because all the gods were pissed.
Yes.
And you had to figure out how to please which one and which one you didn't please.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine how anxious they were during that particular time, never knowing where you stand with God. And to me, that's what the good news is now you know where you've always stood with the divine.
Correct. Right.
Good God, we're preaching.
That feels a lot better, doesn't it? That feels a lot better.
But the question is, do we know where we stand with God because of 2,000 years ago? And that's where you were tracking.
Yes. So to continue on with Jesus, the individual, when you're using the apostolic language of sacrifice, Paul is going to change that up, for example, completely, because Paul is going to go from the external to the internal. And Paul is going to say that crucifixion with Christ is all about putting to death the old man, putting to death the self, which, as we've already talked about at great length, is putting to death of the egoic, instinctive self of doing. And so the faith of Christ was that he would sacrifice his egoic desires. He would sacrifice his doing. He would sacrifice himself and his biological form with the faith that God and God alone could give him life from the dead. And that resurrection theme of Jesus, when Jesus was raised from the tomb, that was an outward sign of a greater spiritual reality, just like the cross was an outward sign of a greater spiritual reality. The cross was a sign that Jesus was no longer going to live according to selfish source and was not going to live according to his egoic desire to be like God. Rather, he was going to put or allow himself to be put to death, and which he did. Then the resurrection from the tomb is a sign that God and God alone is the source of deliverance, which was the salvation. This was a salvation experience, if you will, in the sense that Jesus is saved from the grave. And that is this idea of being saved from death. But that death that was symbolized by a biological body coming out of the ground actually had a much greater spiritual reality, and that was being saved from the death that is a symbol of separation from God, that there's something that a person has to do in order to be okay with God, in order to be one with God, and that is what will make the oneness occur. So you have Jesus the individual, and there is in that sense then the cornerstone of salvation. So in that sense, they were experiencing salvation as an already event through the cross, but there was also a component called the not yet. So you have both the already and the not yet. The already was the cross. The not yet was that, first of all, you have a creation or world symbolized by Jerusalem, temple, and all the things we talked about that had not yet passed. And in fact, the ministry of Peter, James, and John was to go to all of those followers who were still in that world and preach this gospel of the coming freedom and the deliverance from the bondage of sin and death to all those who were of Israel. And Paul's job was to preach to all those who were in the Gentile nations surrounding Israel. So in the sense that Paul, for example, saw that the end was coming to the covenantal system that was a system of law and doing and therefore bondage to sin and death, Paul could say, it is high time to awaken, Romans 13:12, because now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed.
And this is post-cross.
That's post-cross. And so if we're saying that salvation was purely only a reductionist view of what Jesus did at the cross, then we're missing the collective. We've left the collective out. The collective is modeling the faith of Christ. What were they doing? They weren't physically going to a cross and being crucified. Their baptism was a symbol of crucifying the self. So everything becomes a symbol at that point for them, just like their resurrection from the dead was not going to be a biological resurrection any more than their crucifixion was going to be a biological crucifixion. Their resurrection was that they were going to be raised into a new space called new heaven and earth, or into a new agreement or covenant, which is that God and God alone is the source, and that symbolized that there was not going to be any more keeping of boundaries, law, for the purpose of establishing one's God identity. And so with that, you would also have Peter in 1 Peter chapter 1, and he's talking about they were waiting for the salvation that was ready to appear or about to appear. That Greek word there is mello, and it means about to or ready, on the point of happening. A little interesting side note that many of you who follow presence know from reading some of the past works of my dad, Max King, is that this word mellow is oftentimes not even translated in the King James or New International or most versions. It's oftentimes just left out, and the translators did not know what to do because so many places in the New Testament, the writers are talking about things that are about to happen. Mm-hmm. And so because up until recently, people thought, no, this is still way out in the future, they thought, well, maybe they just used that word to mean something like, well, it's certainly going to happen. But that's not at all what its original meaning is in context.
But
so
they're
anyway,
still not using the "it did happen."
No. And see, this is the important thing of the narrative. We have a fulfilled narrative today. This is what guides my life, is I have a story that goes from the beginning and it has an end. And I also understand where I stand now in this new space that does not have an end. I understand the nature of the space that I'm in now and its aspects that does not have an end. That deliverance into that space was a salvation movement, salvation trajectory, just like when God delivered Israel from Egyptian bondage. That was a salvation experience for them. And that experience happened over a 40-year period. But we could say that was their salvation from slavery. Mm-hmm. So because salvation and deliverance are also words that are pretty much the same words. So in that sense, Cody, it seems very clear to us from the narrative that you have those two components. And so the cross is the cornerstone of it. And then the collective, the body of Christ, they were also modeling the deliverance from bondage. And that was going to be symbolized not by them coming up out of a literal physical grave. That was going to be symbolized by a temple falling. That was going to be symbolized by Jerusalem going down, the priesthood disappearing, the priests disappearing, the sacrificial sacrifices disappearing, genealogy disappeared. When all of those external things disappeared, then And only then was salvation complete. And that was the completion of salvation. So it was twofold.
Good Lord.
Twofold.
Okay. Everybody breathe. Couple things then. So in the good blue meme that I grew up in, they would agree with you on this point. They would say, you're right. I was justified or saved. I can't believe I'm getting into this language.
No, this is good.
But then they'll say that happened at the cross.
Right.
But they would still place themselves as holding out for ultimate salvation, or what they may call sanctification. So they had like justification, sanctification. That's the process. But then they would also had glorification. I just said those words.
That's good.
My God, it's bringing chills. It's really not good. So they would just place the ultimate final salvation as something still to come.
Yes.
So what you're saying is actually that's the miss, is because yet you're still trying to do something.
Yes.
And this was completed.
Yes.
Was completed. And what's really funny, we don't have time to go into this, but then there are a lot of folks that would say, well, yeah, it finished with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Like he was enough.
Of course.
But then they would continue to go on with, he was enough, but you need to recite this prayer, and or you need to repent of your sin, or something you need to do.
Yes.
So it's like, is he enough or is he not enough?
Mm-hmm.
And what do we have to do? What do we not have to do? Yes. And you're saying there's a 40-year period, which you see that metaphor with Israel coming out of Egypt.
Yeah.
And them wandering in the wilderness and then walking into Canaan.
Yes.
And you're saying Canaan is not something to come.
Right.
It's something that is here now, because it never was about an external literal place.
Correct.
It's about a stage of consciousness.
Bingo.
Good Lord.
That
okay,
is
so
it.
If we're asking what is salvation now, Doug, is it fair to say, so salvation then is discovering and waking up to who we already are and what we somehow unconsciously know?
That's a great description. Because this is the purpose of the narrative today. That's its role and function. That's how we're using it, right? When we're having conversations with all the people that are coming through here, we're using the narrative to show just exactly what you just said. The narrative is helping people everywhere become conscious of the salvation that they already have, the identity they already are. And that makes a huge difference. When we pick this up in the middle of January, we'll pick up these threads again, because there's some more theology to go with this, meaning some more biblical narrative, and so many threads that wind through that are going to allow us to reemphasize this over and over again. So this, while this is a good stopping place, I think our time is about up. This is not by any means the end of this discussion on salvation, Cody.
Yeah. I don't want to end because I still have so many questions. So yeah, we got to end. It's okay. When we come back mid-January.
Yep.
Let's pick it up right where we left off.
Sounds great.
Awesome. So for those of you that are listening, we're going to take a break. Hope you have a fantastic holiday season. And I hope you celebrate. And I hope as you start 2019, man, I hope it's the greatest year of your life.
Me too. Happy holidays, everybody.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.